Welcome to the American Security Council Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. The mission of the American Security Council is to educate and engage American citizens on national security matters, economic security matters, and the need for moral leadership in the United States of America. Please enjoy the podcast.
Welcome. I'm Joy Votrobek, your host here at the American Security Council Foundation's on Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. And on today's show, we welcome back Senior Fellows Dr. Scott Tilley. We will be discussing his article on SolarWinds, the cybersecurity attack that CBS has called the most sophisticated cybersecurity attack in American history. Before we get into that, I just want to say you can find Scott's article under position papers on our website at www.ascf.us. For the ASCF to continue this Protecting Our Freedoms podcast and many other programs, we need your help. So if you would go on while you're on our website, go to our donate page, and we would greatly appreciate that. And if you can volunteer in any way, we appreciate that as well. And Scott, it's great to have you back again.
Well, thank you.
And today, and I know a lot of people maybe don't always pay attention to the cybersecurity issue on things, but there's been quite a few hacks continuing. And the big one, the Colonial Pipeline, I think really brought attention to a lot of Americans on how the cybersecurity attacks affect their freedoms in daily business operations and their supplies, like the fuel for their cars. So you mentioned in your article that CBS, as I said the SolarWinds cyber attack was the most sophisticated cyber attack in American history. Can you expand a little on why it was such a sophisticated attack and why it matters to businesses and individuals?
Sure. Well, SolarWinds is a company. It's based in Austin, Texas, and one of their main products is called Orion. And basically, it's used by large enterprises to manage their computer networks. And it's like most enterprise software, it's a very complex program. It's complex to engineer, it's complex to install and to manage, but it's there to actually make large networks easier to control. And what happened is basically there was two hacks of SolarWinds. One was a more minor attack, but the main one occurred, as far as we can tell, in March of 2020. But it wasn't detected until December. So there was many months of basically the software that is part of Orion was compromised. And the thing is, it's used by over 18,000 customers, and that includes many parts of the federal government, including, for example, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and so on. So this is a very sophisticated attack. It's called a supply chain attack. So what happens is when software of this scale gets, we'll call it built, it's almost like an assembly line. The hackers were able to insert into the build process basically a compromised piece of software. But it was very, very difficult to detect because they were able to hide it. So every time a new update of this software was sent to these 18,000 customers, they get infected. So they're not actually, getting infected directly. They're getting infected because of the software that's coming from SolarWinds. And the software itself, the hack, was basically sending data of everything that was going on the network back to the hackers. And it took a company called FireEye, which is one of the leading cybersecurity firms in the country, to determine that they had been hacked, and only because they also used Orion and they were hacked. But they were determined. Then they called in people from Carnegie Mellon and other, federal authorities to determine what was going on. But even now, So we're talking, if it started in March 2020, it's over a year. Many companies, if they've not updated properly, they're still infected. So they're still sending out all data of everything that's going on in their network back to the hackers. So that's why that was called, the biggest hack in U.S. history so far. And very sophisticated because it was very, very subtle. Supply chain hacks, sometimes called DevOps hacks, are just really, really difficult to detect. And the software that is often used, sort of you might call like antivirus software that people are familiar with, like Norton or something, they typically can only detect known problems. This was a completely new sort of attack, and therefore it just went undetected. And I did mention that this was attacking things like the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, the organization that manages our nuclear arsenal. I mean, it was really widespread. No. And even now, that they're still basically trying to scrub all these systems to remove this vulnerability.
That was my understanding too. Yes. How long do you think it will take to deal with this fallout?
Probably to the end of the year at least, because there's so many customers that are reluctant, I would say, and for good reasons, to keep updating their software all the time because it's very disruptive. And they're reluctant because sometimes things like this happen. Every time large companies, like Microsoft, I'll just pick Microsoft as an example, when they send out patches, not all the time do the patches work, and it causes other problems on the network. So many companies with their large IT organizations are reluctant to basically maintain this, weekly patching and updating of all the software. The main problem is that the software, Orion is just one example, are incredibly complicated. When they're going through this build process, as I said, think of it like an assembly line. You're talking of tens of thousands of files that are all being compiled, manipulated, manually, automatically processed. So to have visibility into one problem, it's almost impossible. I'm sure that if you asked almost anyone at these large companies, exactly how does your software work, no one would know. It's just too complicated.
So, and what I think I hear you saying is, like people's software, like Norton or McAfee, they're picking up known problems, and this was not a known problem.
That's correct. Now, there are some more sophisticated cybersecurity programs out there that rely on machine learning and artificial intelligence that basically look for emerging patterns, so not something they already know. The thing is, they're not very widely used yet. They themselves are very sophisticated. So you might see advertisements for them in the Wall Street Journal and stuff, but they're not widely used. And the thing about a supply chain, which is, again, it's called a supply chain attack, is it's kind of like, you only need to attack the weakest link, and then it gets propagated through every other program that uses it. So SolarWinds program, which is then used by all these other agencies, the agencies themselves aren't hacked. They get hacked because they're using something that was hacked. And other companies that rely on their services, which many do, they are basically hacked as well. So it just kind of bubbles along this supply chain. Yeah.
So should businesses and individuals make sure to do their updates on a constant basis?
That's sort of a yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, I think individuals certainly should. Every time you get an update, I use a Mac. Every time I get something that says, here's the latest, Mac OS update, I always apply it. But I do know other people that rely on other software that when they apply these patches, these updates, it stops working. Zoom would be an example. I know people that use Zoom, but when they apply the latest update to the operating system, it stops working. And then they're like, oh my goodness, and they have to call the IT department and try and reverse the patch and stuff. It's because doing these updates, the patches themselves are also incredibly complicated. You can imagine trying to update something like Microsoft Windows, which has millions of lines of code, and making sure that every time you do it, nothing breaks and it only gets better. You have to be very optimistic, I would say, for it to work all the time.
And that brings me into another point or a question, I guess. There's 4 main foreign actors that American Security Council Foundation watches and knows that are capable of cyber attacks, mainly China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Yes.
There's been articles written by CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, on gray zone tactics used by these 4 countries, otherwise known as hybrid warfare. This gray zone tactics, they're affecting our freedoms by attacking America without even having to fire a shot. So they're interfering with elections, our healthcare facilities and schools, as we've discussed before on your last broadcast here, and our infrastructure. So the news, I hear, blames Russia for the SolarWinds attack. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Everything that I've read indicates that it's Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, called SVR, as the likely culprit. They certainly have the capability. This was not like a one-person sitting in the basement attack. This was a team-based attack, which took quite a while. Because first they had to infiltrate the SolarWinds network. Then they had to insert this sort of Trojan program, and both of which would not be easy. And therefore, it's extremely likely that it was them. It has to be a nation state, not a company. Due
to the sophistication of it, is that your opinion?
Yes.
Okay.
Due to the sophistication and also the novelty of the attack, because again, inserting one of these things into the supply chain in the build process is something that most companies do not even think about defending themselves against. They think about running antivirus software on the code, but this was a bit different. This was actually inserting something in the middle of the you might call it the manufacturing process.
Certainly a smart move if it's a foreign actor, and it's certainly a concern if they're trying to look into our federal or hack into our federal programs.
Yes, because it was used, as I said, by over 18,000 different customers, including many federal agencies. All the network traffic that was on these federal agency networks was exposed to the hackers, which is, if it was Russia, then it's like, yeah, that's not good.
And you mentioned Microsoft took a hit. I had read some things that it was possible that China might also be trying to use this SolarWinds hack for their advantage. Is that a possibility?
It's certainly a possibility. I haven't read too much about that part, but it wouldn't surprise me because, China also has a very sophisticated hacking facility as part of the People's Army based in Shanghai, and they're constantly probing our networks and also companies. If they're not hacking, they're trying to steal intellectual property. It just happens all the time.
Right. Oh, yes. The stealing intellectual property is certainly a concern as well. We've discussed that before quite a few times. Do you think of these other, Iran, North Korea, would they try to jump on this as well? Is that a possibility?
Yes, probably, but I would put those two in sort of tier 2. I would put sort of Russia and China as tier 1 and North Korea and Iran as tier 2 in terms of their sophisticated ability to do damage to our networks or to our IP. But there's no doubt that they keep trying because it's that sort of, as you said, it's like modern warfare without having to fire a shot. They don't even have to leave their homes. They just do it remotely.
Yes, we're in a new era of warfare here with this hybrid or gray zone, as they call it,
Yes.
being able to attack us from within.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. And once it's within, like the Orion hack, it's really hard to get out. Really hard.
So it's going to take some time to get through all that.
Yes.
And in the meantime, we continue to have more cyber attacks.
Yeah, as we said, maybe next time we'll talk about the Colonial Pipeline attack, which is a ransomware attack, different than the Orion attack. You know, the Orion and the SolarWinds problem could have been far, far worse than it was. It was basically something that they inserted into the system and then just basically were quietly lurking there and sending out information. But they could have been changing the network. They could have been deleting data. All these things were possible. They basically were just lurking quietly, and you might call it just listening, you know, in an old spy scenario, just listening to what's going on, but not doing anything.
Okay. And in your article, you mentioned SASA, or CISA, the government cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency.
Yes.
Public information is available, I believe, on their site. Is that correct? As far as patches are concerned and these hacks?
Yes. Interestingly, however, if I'm not mistaken, the head of SASA resigned or was fired, whatever you want to call it, over SolarWinds because they didn't detect this. And you might say, well, why didn't you detect this? They use a system called Einstein, nice name, for detecting cyber intrusions and so on. But as I said before, it only detects intrusions that it knows about. And it knows about a lot, but it didn't know about this one.
I hear you.
So basically, they kind of fell down on this, kind of failed. But in their defense, they've done an incredibly difficult job. I think, as I said before, if you're defending against a cyber attack, you have to defend against absolutely everyone. If you're attacking, you only need to get through once. So it's not an evenly weighted, battle. It's not like a game of chess or something. It's just really challenging. And because these attacks are changing literally every day. I mean, I mentioned that people now use machine learning and artificial intelligence to start to defend against changing attacks. But that also means the bad guys are using the same technology to attack and to probe networks in very novel ways. So it's not easy, for sure.
Well, that leads right into my final question is, in your opinion, how can we be more prepared for future cyber attacks to our federal government businesses and infrastructure?
Well, we're in a very difficult situation in the sense that I believe last time we talked about the water system that was hacked over in Tampa, Florida. Every time you have a system that is on a network, and we want them on networks so you can access them remotely, or they can use other services, right? Whenever you do that, you open yourself up to being hacked. So we have a fundamental challenge of how do you have something that is networked and available to other programs or other people, but at the same time be secure. And right now, I would say most software that is on a network is not secure. And again, you only need one entry point.
Right.
And once you're in, there's typically not many other monitor systems that are watching for things. This is not like that old television show 24. Every time someone went in, there was like warnings on the screen. Oh, they're trying to access information. Most companies don't do something like that because it's expensive. It's very complicated. You need a lot of well-educated people to be able to monitor it. So, if someone hired me and said, how can you be more prepared against future cyber attacks? Well, the old answer is take your system off the network.
They're most likely not going to do.
One that's in a block.
Now, that brings up, I've heard a lot of good things about blockchain. What is your thoughts on that as far as protection?
So we should have maybe a future talk on blockchain. Blockchain it's good in the sense that every transaction cannot be changed, and it's in the public. But it doesn't really work for a cyber attack. It's more about transactions.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why they use it for a lot of the cryptocurrencies, I understand.
That's correct. All the things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on. Mm-hmm. It's because whenever there's a transaction that's done, it's if you think of like a bank ledger, and you imagine if you had a paper ledger and you went back and sort of just crossed something out. With Bitcoin, with blockchain, I should say, you can't do that. Once it's done, it's done. Okay. And it's public, so everyone can see all the transactions. But it doesn't really protect against attacks so much. I mean, it's a part of the whole package, I suppose, but it's not in the same way as some of these other things we were talking about.
Okay, so that's more or less protecting your transactions, not so much against cyber attacks.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And then I also understand that a lot of companies are not reporting cyber attacks for fear of saving face, I guess.
Yeah. As I said, maybe next time we'll talk about Colonial Pipeline. But the news yesterday that the CEO agreed to pay almost $5 million to unlock the pipeline software, which turned out didn't work, by the way. The decryption code that they were sent, I believe, didn't work, and they basically had to go back from their backups. It just tells you that they think basically they have no choice. They just have to pay the ransom, which goes completely against U.S. policy. It's basically You're paying a digital terrorist.
Yes, I was going to bring that up because I know I heard of another cyber attack that happened several months ago, and I believe they paid the ransom as well, which I would think would encourage more of these cyber ransomware attacks if they're going to get paid.
Absolutely. I believe I read that there was several $100 million made in Bitcoin money through ransomware attacks last year. So it's very lucrative. I get email, by the way, almost every day. They're fake emails, but they're telling me that one of my many email accounts have been hacked, and they've been watching me on the camera and blah blah blah, and you have to pay them for Bitcoin. But these are fake, but they're not all fake. The ones who attack the companies, they're real. They basically encrypt their data, and they can't get access to them, or they sell them on the open market.
Now, is that mainly when you? This is what I've heard. Like when you open a link or you open a folder, is that how they get the attack into the computer?
It's like they were remotely accessing your computer. So imagine you're sitting at home and you log into your computer from work, okay? Or from home to work. And when they do that, then they either remove or encrypt the data so you don't have access to it anymore.
Okay, so like we saw with the Ellesmere water supply.
Say that again?
Like we saw with the Ellesmere over in Tampa, the water supply, where it was just moving on its own. The guy had noticed the mouse moving on its own.
Yeah, so but for example, the Colonial Pipeline, they basically encrypt all the data. So you might have a folder on your computer, but you can't read it anymore because they've encrypted it, and they have the key and you don't.
And that's where the ransomware comes in to unlock it.
That's right. Ransom is you pay, then they send you the key to unlock the file. Yeah.
Which, like you said, goes against U.S. policy on not paying terrorists.
It does, although we clearly do.
Yes. Well, I think there's
policy is not to do it.
Interest by businesses to keep themselves up and running, so that might be a hard line there.
Yeah, my guess is, I'm sure that the importance of the Colonial Pipeline to the national infrastructure, I'm absolutely sure they involve, a bunch of federal agencies to try and figure out how to, undo it. But I think they eventually just said, just pay. We just can't fix this. And we can't have no gasoline and diesel and stuff flowing to the East Coast, so just no choice.
Okay,
but you can imagine what that might be, going forward for, airlines or energy, all these things. Yeah.
And like we discussed, healthcare system, hospitals, schools, stuff like that. So
and all of these are vulnerable. That proves that they're vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't want to take too much away from the colonial pipelines because we'll discuss that again in your future podcast and on your article that's coming out.
Yeah. Yeah. This month I'm going to be writing about ransomware and talking about colonial pipeline.
Okay, sounds great. And thank you very much for coming on. Do you have any other points to make before we close up here?
No, I think that's good. I just, I wish we weren't in this situation and we weren't being, attacked by all these different nation states. But that's real politics. That's what's happening. Yeah.
And the new hybrid warfare that we're in. So.
Yes, indeed. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we will find a way to combat this, but in the meantime, we need to be aware of these.
Well, I'm hoping that in the background we've got our own people doing something similar, but they don't talk about it.
Yes, I would guess we do, and no, I don't hear much about that either.
Yeah, well, for good reason. I mean, it's part of our national security. So, yeah.
Understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for joining us again today. And I always look forward to hearing your tech talks and breaking down these technical issues. So,
all right. Well, thank you for having me.
And you can check out all of Scott's articles on our website under Position Papers. He's got a new one out. It's on our front page, homepage. That's www.ascf.us. And while you're there, please support this podcast and our many other interesting programs that we have going on by donating today. All of our podcasts can be viewed on our website and also on Rumble and YouTube by typing in AmericanSecurityCouncilFoundation.com. American Security Council Foundation. Please subscribe to our channel, comment, and share our podcast with your friends and family. Thank you for joining our podcast today, and please join us again next time as we talk more about protecting your freedoms.